So when we leave the military, we're like supercomputer decision makers. So when you implant that brain into a company, ask most veterans, they won't even like, oh, I guess I am, and because I've been recently talking about this, they don't think it's a big deal, but it is a big deal.
Hi, I'm Ed Marsh, host of the Industrial Growth Institute podcast. Let's start this episode with a question. When you think of revenue growth, do you immediately think organic growth, or is one of your default growth options inorganic? Now, I maintain that inorganic is often overlooked, particularly by the lower middle market, and I'm pumped to dig into that today in today's episode with John Panaccione. John's an amazing guy. In 2020, he founded Fola Capital, and he holds a full array of SEC licenses, including Series 7 and 24 and 79 and 63. And some of you may know what that means, and John may tell us some more about that. Fola Capital is an SEC registered broker-dealer, and it helps entrepreneurs and small business owners raise capital. Now, I met him at an earlier stage in both of our careers when he was the co-founder and CEO of Logic Bay Corporation, which was both a learning management system and a partner relationship management software company that he ran from 2003 until his successful exit in 2020 when it was acquired by Pluribus Technologies. Through that experience, of course, he gained deep insight into small business finance and transactions and a lot of stuff around M&A. But there's no moss growing on the John Panaccione stone. He is always on the move. And I've also known him in a completely different capacity as one of the co-founders of Vet to CEO, an organization that he co-launched in 2013. Vet to CEO is a nonprofit aiding transitioning military personnel and considering entrepreneurship. In 2022, he facilitated the merger of Vet to CEO with Warrior Rising. And when I was a VFW post commander, I actually worked with John to run the first in-person cohort of the Vet to CEO program that had been previously only delivered online. John works tirelessly on behalf of veterans, and I see every day in his posts and in the periodic conversations we have how deeply committed he is to helping vets succeed. Before any of this professional accomplishment, John and I were actually in the 82nd Airborne Division at the same time, although we didn't meet then. He spent 6 years as an armor officer, so there's a visual for you, parachuting tanks into a drop zone. That's what John did. And various leadership roles in operations and sales across various corporate sizes. He's got deep experience in training and learning management system design and implementation. And for the formal details, John holds a BS in criminal justice and an MBA, both from Bryant University, his MBA focusing on technology and operations management. So no matter where you are in your revenue growth journey or what your role or seniority, I know John is going to drop some serious material here today. Be sure to like it, share the episode, leave a review for the podcast, help some more folks find this kind of powerful information. And so with that, let's jump in all the way, John.
Hey, Ed, great to have you here. I just wish I could regurgitate that intro to my wife when I get home. That was like, I don't know what to think about that intro, but I appreciate the summary.
Well, when we publish it, you can give her a link to the recording.
Yeah, I will. You got to listen to this.
All right, so we probably need to start with some important disclaimer that none of what we're going to talk about is construed as specific advice. So I'll let you handle whatever you want to say about that, John.
Yeah, I don't know where we'll go, but, if we talk about my day job and helping raise capital, we're a regulated entity and nothing I say should be construed as investment advice. I'll just leave it at that.
Cool. All right. So your accent sounds more New England than Wilmington, North Carolina, where you are now, but Panaccione doesn't sound like a South Boston Irish name. So fill us in. What's your background?
Yeah, well, I'm an Italian from Rhode Island, which is a punchline for some jokes on my day job. But yeah, I grew up in Rhode Island, went in the Army after college, and went to North Carolina predominantly to serve in the 82nd, as you've mentioned, and kind of fell in love with the area and honestly fell out of love with Rhode Island and realized there were other parts of the country that had different attributes than what I grew up around. Still a great state. I go back every year for its own right. But I really love the Southeast in particular. And I moved here in 2010 after I got my master's degree after I'd left the Army.
And so through your professional career, you've been working out of Wilmington then?
Not entirely. I spent let's see, good number of years in Rhode Island, and I worked for MetLife for a while. I worked up in the Boston area for a Paul Allen founded company, the second company Paul Allen founded after Microsoft. I was running their services group for a while. That was outside of Boston. So I spent a good amount of time either in New York or Boston. Then I took a job in Chicago. I was actually commuting to Chicago every
Wow.
week on a Southwest flight. Same people on the flight coming and going. It's pretty funny. And then after all of that, I started my business in 2003. Then in 2010, I moved down to North Carolina, and I haven't left.
Got it. Obviously, the Army has a very strong training culture. Those of people who hear folks like us tell stories or maybe have experience with it personally, I think they'll resonate with them. We even have sayings that you fight the way you train, and more sweat in training, less blood in battle. Is that training background that was inculcated in you in the Army what led you into your journey that kind of took you down this LMS path?
Um, Honestly, I don't think so. I kind of fell into that. I think my Army experience got me the job at MetLife in the late '90s, and they wanted to hire an outsider to get a training project done. This was back in the days of CD-ROM training, and they had tried forever to get a simple new employee orientation training thing done and using computers, which was a big deal back then, and they couldn't get it done, so they put a requisition out for an outsider, and I got the job. I come to find out because my boss had spent a few years in ROTC, never went in, but based on his extensive military background, and he's a great guy, he kind of picked me out of the pile of resumes, and more to it than that, but I got the job, and that was my first foray into formal training.
I see.
And kind of went up quickly from there. We can get into that if you want.
Yeah, I think we may touch on it. My sense is that many people think of an LMS as a system to deliver training, but you help me see it differently. You help me understand that the success of training depends on the content. And so you've always had a very strong content mindset. The LMS is almost just the vehicle. The content is the training. And I watched as you and Seth Jacobson and your team at Logic Bay applied that to marketing as well. You were early adopters of HubSpot's content marketing methodology back when they called it inbound marketing. Is there a connection between the way you think about content for training and content for marketing?
No, very similar actually. And the platforms like the LMS, for example, when it comes to training, the old analogy is the race car, race tracks and analogy. So the LMS or even HubSpot, from a marketing perspective, that's the racetrack, right? It's a nice racetrack, it's built well and solid, but it doesn't mean anything unless you have race cars, which is the content. So, the quality of the system working well together is a combination of those two things. I've seen really good systems that are flawless technically deliver garbage content, and it's not moving the needle at all on the organization consuming that content. You really got to get the two right. You got to have the good platform that serves up the right content at the right time, and then you have to have super high quality content at the point where it matters.
Right. So you've been involved or spectating inbound marketing for a number of years. What's your sense? Is it working as well today as it used to, or how has it evolved?
Yeah, I remember when we first started it. Long story short, we started doing inbound, and like within a couple of months, I landed like a $400,000 contract with a Fortune 500 company that I would never have even thought to put on an outbound marketing list. This
Right.
company came out of nowhere, and it was a classic inbound success. They had a pain point. They were doing research. They found us. It was even in an industry I'd not even serviced before,
Hmm.
and it was a name everybody would recognize. I just don't want to mention it. It was a long time ago. But man, I was shocked. And of course, we threw more coal on that fire
Right.
and did a lot more inbound after that, and haven't stopped since.
But I hear from a lot of companies that it's still important to do. It still plays a role in their marketing. It's great because it also is a vehicle to create sales enablement content that helps in the sales process, but that inbound is not as powerful as it used to be. You're not likely to get that kind of a huge deal in very short order. You're not likely to generate as many high qualified leads as before. Have you seen that? Because I know you continue to do it in your new business as well.
Absolutely, Ed. I think the market in general has changed dramatically since that success story I told you about. That was a long time ago. I think now just buying behaviors changed so dramatically that,
Right.
of course, people are doing research before they do anything nowadays. So it's not as uh, unusual for people to use inbound first of all. So it's become very noisy out there. So the challenge now is to sift through the noise and be found through the noise
Right.
by prospective clients, if that makes sense. I've seen that's how it's changed. It's a lot noisier.
Yeah, I think I'm hearing that from everybody, and doesn't mean that it's still not important. Outbound sales remains important. Inbound marketing remains important, but you got to be sharper. You got to be better. You have to be more focused. You have to do better research. You have to understand buyers. It's definitely changing. Speaking of understanding buyers,
Can I add
you
something to that before we
sorry,
move on? Can
yeah,
I add
please.
something to that? We also, at that success I told you about, our pendulum swung way too far to the inbound. So we were like, wow, this stuff works. Let's do everything in inbound. And I learned the hard way that no, 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 no. There's like a fine line for every company. The balance, you have to have the balance between outbound and inbound,
Right.
and they have to work well together. And I have learned the hard way that that's really what's required. And I just wanted to make sure that was said.
Yeah, and you learned that lesson, I would say, so clearly that if I understand correctly, you've committed to outbound sales as part of your current business. You even went and bought an RV so that you could do a road show and be different places and be selling it and be there where people are getting together.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. We laugh about that, but I'm so old I own an RV now. But yeah, you got to be out there. I mean, when we raise money now, people don't stroke a large check to invest in something unless they've like shaken your hand and looked in the eyes of the person they're investing in, our clients. And that's true. And yet, so we have to do that. We have to do a lot of that in my day job now because you have to. It's
Right,
not just sit back and watch the money roll in off the internet. It just doesn't work that way.
right.
And the same is true in industrial manufacturing and in any industry, I think.
And speaking of industries, you were in an interesting spot because you were in the SaaS world. You were running a software company, but you ended up focusing largely on industrials. So you're at the intersection of SaaS and industrial, using your expertise in building solutions around sales channel management. That's a category adjacent. The PRM is adjacent to CRM, um, partner relationship management. Some companies emphasize it. Some just think it's something that happens. Some try to incorporate it into their CRM. But let's go back to this point about industrial and SaaS. Many see them as completely incompatible, but you blended them together. How did that fit, and do you think it continues to fit?
I think I think it fits more in industrial manufacturing, just having been in the industry a while. And here's why. I mean, the value chain between the end customer and the manufacturer is usually in industrial manufacturing populated with independent dealers and sales reps, right? Organizations, unlike in most other industries. So think of a piece of heavy equipment like a truck or a tractor or something. It's usually some licensed dealer that's a separate organization, separate company licensed by the manufacturer to represent them. And that separate company then is representing that brand to the end customer. And that's so true in industrial manufacturing. That's why SaaS and the ability to reach out and touch and support those people on a daily basis at scale, that's screaming for SaaS, number one. And number two, unlike a direct organization, the quality of the content, back to that point, it's got to be high quality because it's representing the brand that you're leaning on these dealers to represent. And if your content stinks, it's a reflection of the brand, right? So it's all wrapped together.
And in many cases, that content actually has to do your selling for you because some of the channel partner salespeople aren't great. And if you can give them great content that kind of does the selling for them, then that's the way that you can actually kind of influence the process, even though you're not part of that organization.
Yeah, and you know what? I've learned that from my clients over the years. As you know, I had some pretty great clients. My largest client was Caterpillar. And they're such a great organization, and they're well respected. And one of the reasons they do a good job through this channel I'm talking about, the environment, is that they put a lot of effort into the quality of everything they do, from their products to their training to their infrastructure, and not only them, but Daimler Trucks, Freightliner, all those brands that do a really good job at scale. One of the reasons they're world leaders in their industries is they pay attention to the details of some of the stuff we're talking about here today.
So those are big name companies, but let's talk about, say, a 50 or $100 million industrial manufacturer that sells through indirect channel. Should they consider PRM as a standalone software? I understand you're not in the business anymore, but as an insider with great perspective, should they use any tool? Should they try to have reps participate in the CRM? Should they use a PRM? What makes most sense?
Yeah, I'm having flashbacks from my Logic Bay sales days, but the answer is absolutely yes. When I first started out in the industry, you had to be a Caterpillar or a Daimler to afford to do what we're talking about. So the world's largest corporations invested a lot of money in the technology. Now, remember, way back in the day, this is before Amazon Web Services and the ability to easily spin up an internet environment like within minutes. You either had to have a co-hosting facility or, Lord help us, installing software behind the firewall in an organization. Those days are gone. So today, with all this ubiquitous, easy and lower cost of technology, even a small startup manufacturer can use the same best practices as what used to take millions of dollars. You can now spin up for hundreds of dollars. So
Right.
it absolutely is available to anybody.
Now, there's an evolution that's going on that I know you're a real student of sales and marketing, so I'm sure that this is going to be something that you're familiar with. We talked about outbound sales kind of morphing into inbound marketing, and now increasingly we're hearing about nearbound. Jared Fuller, Joe Rowley, and some others have identified this trend in go-to-market motions with this evolution that's going to this point where the idea is to surround your prospects and customers with partnerships. But you were talking about this years ago, and I remember maybe 5 years ago, we were having a conversation, and I mentioned something about indirect sales channel. And you tried to be gentle, but you said, "Come on, now, Ed, you got to use the right language. It's called a partner ecosystem now." And I hadn't heard that, but obviously you understood this. You saw this happening long before others. How were you able to see so early what was going on?
Were we drinking at the time? But no. I do remember that conversation. Well, I love the word ecosystem because, we live in this world where people can always take another day to look at another option, right? And that's kind of one of the downsides of trying to sell these days. There's always, a lot of your listeners could probably relate to this, right? That's why sales cycles are longer and stuff. So one of the ways to roll with those punches is to think about your role within an ecosystem. So you create these value exchanges that are unique between organizations, that prove to be unique, and the values there. As long as you sustain that value, you continue to produce sales. If it's a drive-by transaction deal, and that's the way you think about it, I think in today's highly fragmented sales environment where you can always look for another alternative, a lot of those companies with those kind of sales approaches are finding it difficult, right? Versus an ecosystem where you're trying to figure out strategically how you can make 1 + 1
Right.
equals three. Creating those scenarios, that's, I think, the key to long-term success.
One of the other really interesting ideas that's coming out of this nearbound discussion, this nearbound community is kind of turning into, is the ability to gain access to new accounts. I think that's the biggest challenge most organizations are facing. It's just really hard for salespeople to get a meeting in a new account with somebody they haven't done business with before. But if you can build that ecosystem, then, I mean, there's even software that looks across CRMs of companies to see where there's commonality in customers to facilitate making an introduction, saying, hey, I don't know if you've ever thought about it. We've done some work side by side with these people. They seem to have helped companies like yours with this. Are you up for a quick meeting with them? And that kind of an introduction or referral is often a good way to get a meeting when these repetitive and inane sales cadences just are beating people over the head and not working anymore.
Yeah, I would agree. I also think in today's competitive world, it's almost like you have to create your own little market niche
Right.
with innovative signals that you send out through high quality content that you want to get the FOMO juices, like fear of missing out, right? Like, if you send some content out that's talking about a new concept in an industry like industrial manufacturing, like, wow, I never heard of that before, I want to learn more, right? That's capturing the attention of someone in a very noisy
Right.
selling and marketing context. And although it's tough to do, I have found that if you can pull that off, that's a really good way to get some leads and accelerate some sales, is if you can
Sure.
create that.
Yeah, good point. Shifting gears a little bit, I know you're a big believer in process. In fact, the core of Vet to CEO was really this idea of building a business plan around the same framework as an Army missions operations order. What are some of the key elements of the revenue growth process that you think are overlooked, that companies omit from their process, that they should make sure they plug back in there and consistently and deliberately incorporate?
Well, let's start with the word process to begin with. I've learned this from you recently too, and hats off to you for thinking about some of the ways you think. But when I went and got my MBA, my specialty was operations and technology, and we looked at manufacturing processes and all the theories behind making that more efficient. And and then when I worked in industrial manufacturing as an industry, I saw this everywhere. Within the factory walls, you have people walking around with calculators and clipboards and
Right.
tweaking things and pulling levers when stuff's not working. And then you go to the sales, or you leave the manufacturer, you go on the road with the salespeople. It's like the Wild West.
Yep.
And I did some time as a sales executive, and I'm glad I did. It was the best part of my career, actually. But then I learned firsthand what the Wild West was. And there's no, till recently, fairly recently, that discipline of applying process to sales and marketing is not. I'd say it's there today, but it absolutely wasn't there for many, many decades. And I think the discipline of applying process in the sales function is absolutely key to success.
Yeah, my impression is it's increasingly there in the SaaS world, where investors are jumping up and down and having a daily temper tantrum wanting to see results. But I think it's much less there in the industrial space, where people have a longer view. They expect lower levels of growth. They respect tradition. They've got long-term employees in the company that don't want to shake things up.
Yeah, I think some people might not like to hear this, but what I learned by working in that space, indirect sales channels, the internet allows you to bypass the dealers and distributors and the salespeople. If you can go right to the end customer and deliver really good content to try to kind of seed the field with potential people that want to buy, and then they have to go to the dealer or distributor to buy from you, you can really move the needle as a manufacturer. It's not that you're cutting out the dealers or distributors, but you're relying on them less to take the message forward from
Right.
there, like we used to do in the old days before the internet. So now, with the end user doing enough research on products, if you're there when they're looking as a manufacturer, then you can energize your ecosystem to deliver a sale to the end customer. And I think that's how it's changed dramatically.
Yeah, so two things there. First of all, you can still rely on the channel to do what they do well with their local proximity, spare parts and service, and all the kind of stuff that they do particularly well, being physically near the buyer. But the other interesting thing is that if you're trying to find a great channel partner, I found it works really well. You use that approach, you develop interest, you create some leads, and then you go to the channel partner and say, hey, we've got these people that want to talk. We'd love to work with you on it. What a great way to start that relationship with a new channel partner.
Yeah, and that's a good example of that 1+1 = 3 equation, right? When you're already, who doesn't like good leads, right? So when you have a way of delivering good leads to a channel partner, they're like, great, where do I sign up? This is great.
Right.
You've already done a lot of the heavy lifting to produce these leads, and you're not relying 100% on that on us, which traditionally has been the case. So yeah, that's a big differentiator.
We talked about LMS, we talked about content, but let's talk about courses. Kind of those two can fit together in this topic of courses. And I know that courses have been a thread that's woven throughout your career. I tend to think of courses as a passive income model, but I think that's short-sighted. I love the example of a guy named Nat Eliason, who's one of the early adopters of Rome Research. It's a personal knowledge management tool. He saw an opportunity, created a course, and basically in a few months secured financial security for his family, and created a community around his course. But passive income isn't the only opportunity with courses. I believe, I can't prove it, and I don't have examples of it, and I'm hoping that you can either correct me if I'm wrong or offer some clarification. I think companies can use courses in other ways, obviously for user training, particularly in the capital equipment space or in technical fields. I think they can use them for lead generation. You can have a course that teaches somebody something that helps with SEO and brings them to your organization, and suddenly they understand why you're an authority on it. You can collect some amazing data through courses. DataBox is doing an interesting project now using a course for partner enablement that's also going to help them collect wide swaths of data from a variety of industries they can then use in their own proprietary research. You've talked about creating certifications. So there's some uses that come to my mind. What am I missing? Is this a huge tool that companies should be thinking about that they generally don't?
Yeah, in fact, I made a lot of mistakes in my career, but one of the most valuable lessons I learned was my Caterpillar experience. We were little old Logic Bay, nobody heard of us, and we sold like a multi-million dollar, multi-year deal to one of the world's largest corporations. And what we did in that instance was we turned a cost center into a profit center. So they used to spend a gazillion dollars on LMSs and pushing content out and paying for everything, and then um, uh, hoping that they move the needle. And this is a long time ago, and we actually went in there with a different approach, and we said, "Hey, look, why don't you turn this into a profit center?" They said, "What do you mean by that?" Well, how about if you charge, I think it was $175 per year per seat to your dealers for an unlimited access to the LMS and the certifications that are required and all the content you push out, but charge the dealers 175 per seat. Now, some of these dealers have thousands of employees, right? Big cat dealers. But it was still less expensive for that dealer to pay that subscription, not have to worry about the LMS and the content and all that, and just let Cat handle it. And then we turned what was a multi-million dollar expense every year and flipped it around and made money at it.
Wow.
And did that for years with them. So that's an example, a real example of how you can think differently about content and LMSs and actually turn it into a profit center if you have the right approach. Got a couple other things, but that's kind of a main point. Any comments on that?
No, keep rolling. This is fascinating.
Yeah. So, and I think part of that, on a related note, I think there's one of the tough things when you design a strategy around this is, what's a course versus, the jargon is performance support.
Okay.
So, when your ice maker breaks in your refrigerator, what do we all do? We go to,
YouTube.
YouTube and we we Google how do you fix an ice maker. That's performance support, right?
Okay.
I just want to see Billy Bob showing me how to fix the ice maker, right? And
Right.
I'm going to go try to fix the ice maker, and I want to spend as least amount of time as possible staring at that video. That's performance support. So think about somebody going out in the middle of a field trying to fix a broken piece of equipment, right? They're not going to sit there and take a course, but if they have access on a tablet or something, they just look up very easily through an indexing system, fix the left front road wheel on a tractor on this type of model, and boop, up it pops, and there's a schematic and everything. And they fix it right the first time. That's what you're looking for. That's performance support.
So that's a
Um,
knowledge base, maybe what I would call it.
Yeah, or a knowledge base. So I think, and I've done this with large companies, you have to step back and go, all right, what are we going to create courses on? For example, in heavy equipment manufacturing, there's different systems. There's electrical systems on heavy equipment. And those are pretty much standard from piece of equipment to piece of equipment. You have to understand how electrical systems work. So that's like a good example of designing a course around that and a certification around it. But when it comes to fixing the electrical failure on XYZ product, that's performance support, right? And
Got
and
it.
then creating a strategy where you're building content in both domains so that it works well together is kind of the holy grail.
Well, then I think of an example completely different than Caterpillar, but HubSpot has always been so amazing in the content they've created. And then they created the Academy, and they started with
Yeah.
some early courses, not even so much about how to use HubSpot software, but about inbound marketing. And then this whole world of marketing directors and marketing managers at various companies around the world they'd heard about inbound marketing, they wanted to learn about it, so they Googled it, and up pops HubSpot's course. And then
Mhm.
when they get ready to go to their boss to suggest they buy software, guess what software they're going to buy? I mean, clearly that's a business development tool that adds real value to people even unrelated to them, not partners, not resellers, just the general community.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of HubSpot. We used to go to what's the annual show? I don't go to it anymore.
Inbound, I think we
Yeah,
drank a couple beers at a couple of those.
yeah. There's always like the inevitable. They love to ask the question, "Hey, what's your HubSpot ID number?" And if it was lower, they'd have a contest. We were always the lowest in the room
Well,
because we signed up really early because my VP of sales knew one of the founders. But to your point, they were a really good case study on how they got everything right. They got educating end users as a strategy to sign them up. You just alluded to. They also got pricing right. So I don't know what it is today, but back in the day, it was like a no brainer to sign up, combined with good quality content and how to think differently about marketing. They put those two things together, and the rest is history.
and they had great
And
tech
it's
support, and they still do. You call and you get somebody on the phone.
right, yeah. So a good example of doing it right.
All right. So what kinds of companies should consider it? I mean, let's talk again about this. We'll use this example of a $50 million company building capital equipment. Should they offer a course? Should it be on some general aspect that they help with? Should they have a knowledge base that talks about their particular equipment? How do you recommend they approach it? And what do you say if their first reaction is, oh my goodness, I don't have time to do what I need to do every day, much less write a blog post, much less create an academy? How do you answer that?
Well, pay me now or pay me later kind of answer, right? So, and I think there's a simple template, and we've already talked about the elements. It's not rocket science. It's like, all right, let's start it with the end customer because they're the most important part of the ecosystem. What can we push to them that represents our brand well, that kind of wins them over, at least from our brand perspective, content wise? And that breaks down mostly into potential courses for customers as well as performance support for customers, right? So start there and then back up from there and say, what do our distribution partners need? And that's going to, now, whether you deliver the old fashioned way or the new way with technology, it has to be done. And, that's where the pay me now, pay me later. So if you're not doing it, I guarantee you one of your competitors is. And in today's day and age, especially with younger decision makers who are more apt to turn to technology for answers, it becomes a hugely competitive issue. And then lastly, and I've done models with spreadsheets like you wouldn't believe over the years on this because of what I did around training. But when you look at the cost of sustaining training, learning, delivery across the ecosystem the old fashioned way, it's buried in cost centers across the enterprise. And you don't really know the true cost. And when it comes to technology based delivery of either marketing or training, it's one number and executives see it and they go, geez, that's expensive. But when you compare that investment versus what you're already spending in all these cost centers that are buried, it's pales in comparison to what you've been spending traditionally. And that's the part a lot of corporations don't think through. But once they figure it out and they see it work, there's no going back. There's no going back.
Yeah, a fascinating point. I see that all the time with capital equipment where the service departments are understaffed. It's hard to find good people. It's hard to retain them. They get burnt out with travel all the time. They're always scrambling, trying to keep up with all of the requirements. And then they end up pissing customers off and they put people off for months. And then the next reorder goes to a competitor because they didn't service it very well, even if it's a great machine. So
Yeah.
those are examples of those huge additional costs that you don't see in that single line item on the P&L, but exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, in fact, what I learned from my customers, which is I've 98% of what I've ever learned was from my customers, but one of them was that they used to focus, the leaders used to focus on the parts counter, parts and aftermarket, because existing customers are coming into the parts desk or calling the parts desk, and the quality of interaction at the parts desk will make or break a brand over time.
Right.
And that I learned that was pretty cool. And they figured out let's really take care of that staff because they are the moment of truth people. Something broke, and they need advice, right?
And let's
So
be honest, those, whether you want to call them customer service or parts counter or whatever, often they consider themselves technicians. They see their job is to do the research, to find the drawing, to help identify the part, to process the order efficiently. But companies need to recognize that they're salespeople. And it's not a dirty word, and call them something different if they get offended by it. But those people need to be selling. So many times I have a conversation with somebody that says, when your customer service person gets a call and says, hey, we need to order this belt, we're going to do a PM, or it's broken, we need to replace it. I never, ever, ever hear the customer service people say, absolutely, I'll get you a price for that. As long as you got the machine apart, got that shaft out, got that bearing out of the way, what about these other three things that often wear out? Is it worth me putting those on the proposal for you so you can just replace them all at the same time while you're at it? I don't hear that. And that's so simple. And all that stuff is really high profit margin. Often companies are making almost as much on the aftermarket as they're making on the sales of machines up front. It just feels like a no-brainer. I don't understand why it's such a struggle.
yeah, well, I couldn't agree with you more, and there's a lot to unpack with that issue. A lot of it is the decision makers, and I hate to maybe uh, insult anybody listening, but if you've never been in sales, like done some time in sales, you don't
Right,
actually recognize the power of what you just said.
right,
That a lot of people like for example, in these industrial manufacturing, particularly, we have a lot of people with very respectable engineering backgrounds, and the mentality with a lot of people is, well, if it's engineered, because we and every engineer in every company thinks that their stuff is the best in the industry, it should sell itself,
right.
right? So because of the engineering that's into it, and we all know that's not true, right? So a lot of inferior products get sold instead because they have better salespeople. So without having run around the block a few times as a salesperson, you don't really understand what you just said. So upselling, cross selling, and just the interaction that has to occur very delicately every day, a number of times, is so important. I couldn't agree with you
And
more.
it's not some kind of a obscene commercialization. It really is in the customer's best interest. If they got the machine apart, let's fix the stuff that or replace the stuff that's wearing out at the same time, because otherwise they're going to break down again in the future.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and then how do you do that at scale is really the challenge, right?
Role playing
And
and coaching, building it into the CRM, building it into all of the tools, and just you got to coach the heck out of it, and you got to use role plays. Coaching without role plays is, I believe, a waste of time.
I couldn't agree with you more. And add to what you're saying, you need technology to do it at scale.
Yep,
You can't do it without technology, and even in a small company,
yep.
because in a small company, if one or two people are the key to helping and coaching, and those people are on vacation or they get hit by a bus or they leave, how do you sustain that knowledge
Right.
within the small company?
All right. Well, I'll get us off this soapbox real quick before we wrap up on courses. Any for that company who listens to this and says, "Geez, we hadn't thought of it. Maybe we should consider it." Are there any call outs that you would recommend they watch out for? Common mistakes that you've seen?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of companies, and I just tell companies not to do this. Is they just go out and they just build content without going through the thought process that we provided the template for, right? What's really needed. What you want to do with anything is put the least amount of effort into something for the most bang for your buck, right? When
Right.
it comes to content, you got to think that way. What's the least amount we can do on with very high quality and invest in that? It's not about how much you produce. It's about how little you produce with high quality, and I think that's the key to success.
Got it. All right, so now let's completely shift gears and let's jump into this macro trend that some are calling a silver tsunami. Tell us what's going on when we hear that term or the silver wave or some of those related things. What's that mean?
Well, I think my definition of it is, when you've got companies that have been doing well, that exist, that, the owner's going to retire or wants to retire or has to retire or whatever, for whatever reason, needs to exit the business. Oftentimes, more often than not, there's no plan. And, because of the baby boomers owning the majority of private businesses in this country, that's a huge both problem and opportunity for younger people to take a look at that as a way to become a small business owner. And for the person trying to retire, you've worked so hard for this company, this thing you've produced, put blood, sweat, and tears in. How do you monetize it in a way that's fair?
And
That's
that you feel good about, where it's not just some kind of a rapacious, investor that's coming in to try to strip everything out and turn it around. I know you've looked at this from a lot of different angles. You've got I think, exit planning certification. You've got all those SEC licenses. But the first place I heard you talking about it was in the context of entrepreneurship, because you've said for a long time that vets who are looking to transition, who don't want to work for the man, they want to have some kind of a business. They got three options. They can start something, which is a grind and often fails. They can buy a franchise, or they can buy an existing business. And with these boomers retiring, there's more and more of those existing businesses coming on the market as owners age. What are you hearing? What kinds of conversations are you participating in, or some of the people you've coached coming back and telling you about?
Yeah, well, I say that almost every day when I talk to veterans and work with companies trying to exit, so which is part of my day job. But yeah, the street path to small business ownership. First of all, I hate the word entrepreneurship because that means a lot of different things to different people. Usually means startup. So the culture in America is it's all about the startup. We all watch Shark Tank. We all have to listen to our in-laws that have two glasses of wine at Thanksgiving with a great idea. Can't understand why nobody's thought about it, but they never do anything about it. So that's like startup culture we have in America. But the other two paths, you already mentioned them, franchising and buying an existing business are viable paths. And on one hand, buying existing business, very recently, I'm noticing a lot more noise around it because the entrepreneur people have come up with this ETA acronym,
Okay.
entrepreneurship through acquisition. So they've put the word entrepreneurship there and they added through acquisition on there. And there's all kinds of strategies, search funds. I'm a search entrepreneur. So I can talk about that if you'd like, because I've got some things that bother me about that movement. But, there's more recognition that that's an opportunity, which is a good sign. Uh, and, I just think it's a market that's always been there. It just hasn't been focused on as much as a viable market for someone trying to become a small business owner.
All right. So you mentioned your day job, full of capital. Let's not get into areas where you have to offer more, warnings or disclaimers or whatever. But what is full of capital? What do you do, and how does that plug into this trend?
Yeah. Well, we do three things. So the main thing we do is we raise capital for small businesses. So we're an SEC registered broker dealer, which means we're regulated, and we know how to do that in accordance with the Securities Act of 1933, which is the law of the land. And we help companies do it the right way. So that's our main business. But we do a couple other things that are related to that. Another thing we do is just basic investment banking, business planning. So wherever you're going to go for capital, whether it's a bank, traditional investors, or what I like to say, investing the modern way, they all three have something in common, and that is you have to have a pretty solid set of information. You have to have solid forecasts, and I don't mean a pro forma. I mean business balance sheet, P&L, and cash flow statement that makes sense. A banker or an investor can tell within 30 seconds whether it's worth the paper it's written on or not. So that has to be done well. Um, investor presentations, narratives, the documentation like operating agreements and bylaws, all of that has to be in alignment. So another thing we do is we work with companies to make sure that that's in alignment and that that's complete, right? Because you can't do anything without that. And then the third thing we do is we help with M&A, mergers and acquisitions, mostly on the buy side. So we help people who want to buy a business. But on the vet to CEO side of the fence, we just launched a new program called Pass the Guide On, which military people know what that means. But it's the act of transferring a business to a veteran. And that program is really designed to educate both buyers and sellers on how the process works. As a quick story, my first business, Logic Bay, in my career, I had been part of buying 7 companies. But the first time I went to sell a company, my own company, was the first time I'd ever sold a company. I was a novice at it, just like anybody else would be, even though I've been running the company for 17 years.
Right.
So there's a lot of things we don't know about how that acquisition process works that both buyers and sellers need to understand. And that's kind of the third thing Fuller Capital does. We help people through that process.
And you said in terms of fundraising, small businesses, what size companies do you work with?
Well, anything from startups to existing businesses. My largest raise right now is $10 million raise for a manufacturer in Virginia, veteran owned. And, we've done startups for like 160,000, that we've raised for them.
And how about on the
Everything in
investment
between.
banking side? What size transactions?
We just started getting into that last year or so because of this problem we're talking about today. There's such a need for it out there. So, I wouldn't say I have a size limit on that, but we've got a growing database. What's interesting, since we launched that program, we have, at least one of them, we have sellers coming out of the woodwork going, "Hey, I heard about this program, and how does it work? Because I need to figure out how to sell this thing. I don't know where to start." So I'm paraphrasing, but we're getting people pleasantly surprised at companies coming out of the woodwork wanting to participate in the program because they want to learn how the process works.
And I assume that many are finding you through your inbound marketing.
Yeah, you're right. If you want to call it that. So we push a lot out for free on high quality webinars, things like that, social media. We pump content out there, and it strikes a nerve with someone who's thinking about trying to sell their business, which we would never, ever find and put on an outbound calling list, right?
Right.
So, yeah, it's working there, too. I never thought of that, Ed. Once again, I learned something from you.
Well, your content creation is amazing. I think you work 9 nights a week between doing veteran stuff 6 nights a week and then business stuff other nights. I mean, you've got an incredible work ethic. That's actually another thread of some of my conversations I've had on this podcast with people who are familiar with the military. The grit, the long-term vision, the determination, the discipline, the work ethic are critical. So anyway, obviously, for these companies that are thinking about selling, a sale to a veteran isn't the only option. Many consider selling to private equity, but there's also a significant opportunity, I believe, for mid-size industrial companies to consider making acquisitions now that more companies are coming on the market. So you can buy market share by acquiring competitors. You can buy access to buyers by acquiring adjacent technology. You can buy recurring revenue by buying maybe some software service that fits within what you do. You can buy key technology or some patents. You can buy key talent by acquiring a company that's got particular skills. You need more service techs. Maybe there's a company that's got great service techs. You can buy diversification across new vertical industry markets or geographic markets. So you can buy growth in a number of ways. And that may just be my simplistic view, but give us a more complete and sophisticated overview of how, again, that $50 to $250 million company might use this opportunity, the silver tsunami, as a way to grow through inorganic growth and achieve certain strategic objectives through some acquisitions.
Yeah, that's a good point because I absolutely think it should absolutely be a top priority because what most companies automatically think about is, well, how can we grow sales organically?
Right.
Or its close cousin. You're always trying to come up with that next new product idea, right? Every company does. So what's our next new product? And we spend a lot of money on those two things. We hire salespeople, we pour more and more money on sales, and then we spend a lot of R&D money trying to develop the next product. But in both instances, acquiring might be a heck of a lot easier.
Right.
And not only just to generically increase sales, but I think the new product development process is another neck and neck reason why companies should look at acquisitions, because there's always somebody who did start a company that has no brand recognition, that has no sales force, but they got a great idea. I see them all the time in my day job. I've seen some really cool companies, but they're strapped for capital.
Right.
But they've spent a lot, engineer founded companies with a great idea. I can give you some examples if you want, but they come to me because they don't have any capital, but they're a good acquisition target for a mid-sized company that says, wow, and that person, he or she would gladly sell early because their alternatives aren't looking too good.
Right.
So everybody wins, right? You bring in a highly trained and expert with that acquisition, but you also bring in a lot of work that they've already done to get the product to where it is. So you kind of get a twofer out of that one. Not only increase sales, but you're increasing the portfolio of products you have to offer.
So mid-sized industrial manufacturers saying, we hadn't really thought of it. This sounds intriguing. Where should they start? What's the first step? Do they call an investment banker? Do they call you? Do they start looking at interesting technology and build a list of companies to reach out to? How do they go about doing it?
Yeah, what I've seen is a lot of the procurement people, the supply side managers of mid-sized companies getting involved in that, right? So, who do we have that's been knocking on our door trying to sell us stuff, or that is currently selling us stuff that alternatively be good acquisition candidates? Large companies have investment divisions that invest in young companies, hoping that they are successful because they're going to buy them later, right? That's a good spot to be in if you're a young company. But there's different levels of that, as you go up and down the size scale. But to answer your question, I think the best place to start is with the people that are responsible for the supply chain to try to identify existing or potential suppliers that they could be acquired.
And how about asking buyers? Have you heard anyone taking that approach to say, hey, what are you really missing that you'd like? Or what's a great product that you buy but you're not getting good support on, or anything like that to try to find out from your current customers?
Yeah, are you talking about asking that question from a company trying to be bought, or the company trying to find
The
companies to
company
buy?
trying to find good acquisition candidates. If you asked your current customers what to get a sense of what they might like you to be able to potentially provide to them.
Yeah, I think there's that's a good practice. Am I seeing that? No, because I've been out of it for a while. I'm not actually looking at that stuff. But
Got it.
from what I have seen is, there's latent needs, and then there's overt needs, right?
Right.
So if everybody in your industry needs a pink hammer, and you don't make pink hammers, you might want to find a place that makes pink hammers, or that can make pink hammers, right? But if you've identified a latent need, like, well, why do you need a hammer? It's because, well, these things are falling apart. Well, maybe they're falling apart because the adhesive that's been used
Right.
stinks, right? So now you create a new adhesive that solves that problem. Now you don't need a pink hammer anymore. That's a latent need, right?
Right.
So I think there's different ways to read the tea leaves with customers to try to identify unmet needs that can be met either by buying an existing product supplier or buying one that can invent this new solution versus feeling like you need to invent that solution internally.
And for a company that's always considered organic growth as a natural way to go, that may be saying, this is interesting, maybe we should think about inorganic growth. Who should drive it? Is it the owners or the board or executive management? I understand, obviously, many of these mid-size privately held manufacturing companies, those all overlap. But if there is some distinction between them, where do you believe the responsibility to initiate this lies?
It's a good question. At the end of the day, it's the owner, right? Who's ever running the show. But back to the point about process, maybe it shouldn't be anyone's responsibility. Maybe it should be baked into the standard operating process. The new product development process. All right, Sally's got a great idea, wants some budget for this great idea. Everybody, the knee-jerk reaction, traditional one would be, Sally's great. Let's give her some budget to do that. Well, maybe the process ought to be timeout. thank you, Sally. Let's scan the market to see if there's anybody doing anything close that we could either partner with or potentially acquire versus taking 3 years and a huge budget for Sally to build it
Right.
from scratch, right?
And then
So
have to
build
build
it
an
into the
entirely new
process.
marketing plan and sales force and channel and everything else.
Yeah, I'd say build it right into the process. Like, don't tie it to any one role, right?
So
And
almost like a corporate development function, a multidiscipline corporate development function within the company.
yeah, I mean, cover it with process discipline, just like we do everywhere else, like we were talking about earlier,
Except
except in
marketing and
sales.
sales.
Yeah. Build it into the process. It should be a no-brainer thing you do intentionally. And then intentionally decide not to do it, right? But at least you have a way of making sure that it's considered.
Right. So what's the typical timeline for a deal? A company like we're talking, using as the example, if they get this bee in their bonnet and they've got an idea for what they might want to acquire, is this something that takes 3 months or does it take 5 years? What should they expect?
I think it falls into the it depends category. You're probably talking at least 6 months to a year. And when they bought my company, it was like 9 months.
Okay.
And on a related note, for small, medium-sized businesses looking to do acquisitions, and what I see a lot of is, well, how do you find these companies that want to get bought? Well, here's the reality. Uh, Most small business owners would tell you that their business is for sale every single day. It's not that they don't like their company. It's just that if somebody walked in and say, "Hey, have you ever thought about selling?" 9 times out of 10, the owner's going to say, "Well, I don't know. What do you have in mind?" Because there's a lot of reasons for that, and they're not bad. That's the reality of it. So, what I've seen to be successful. So this relates to your question, because if the company is on BizQuest or Biz Buy Sell, raising their hand going, "We want to be bought," it's a lot faster. But if you want to find a strategic acquisition, it's usually you're reaching out way early and they're not officially for sale, but it's good to be early, and then you work something out with the owners to maybe work together and test some hypotheses before a transaction, and that's good for the seller as it is for the buying company.
And in your investment banking practice, I assume that you help build the list of targets and facilitate the outreach and conduct the initial discussions and then bring interested parties back to your client.
Yeah, and again, eventually we have to pick a side, but with our nonprofit work, we teach both sides the process, and with pass the guide on, you don't have to be a veteran if you're a seller to or a buyer to kind of go through that process. Where our other program that you know about, you have to be. Um, but when it comes down to actually full of capital work, we have to pick a side eventually. It's usually
Sure.
the buy side.
Right. And so then you would do that work on behalf of the buyer, identifying potential sellers and conducting the early outreach and negotiations.
Yeah, because it comes down to due diligence and what is due diligence? What do you do during due diligence? What do you want to make sure you do during due diligence? And if you've never done that before, you like you don't know what you don't know
Right.
about half of what you're supposed to do before you buy something that's you're going to regret, a week after you bought it. So there's certain best practices and around that. And one other important thing to note about acquisitions is, unlike raising capital and a lot of other things in our world, there's no regulatory process that drives the acquisition process. Like when you go to raise capital, you got to follow the Securities Act of 1933 and all the SEC and FINRA rules that associated with the law. Buying and selling companies, there's no process, no certification to get. So it's kind of the Wild West, and a bunch of players that will tell you, "Hey, this is how it is," but it's not. It's just a bunch of best practices. So what we
Right.
try to do is educate people on those best practices.
So often you're going to be acquiring earnings and maybe even accretive earnings, which I think basically means you get that 1+1 = 3 sort of a thing out of it. But does the acquirer always need to write a check, or can they finance it? Can they finance it against the future earnings? How do you help companies? How do you advise them on the finances of an acquisition?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the good news for a buyer is what's one of the big reasons buying existing business of the three paths is my personal favorite. is you have the opportunity for something called seller financing. So that's when the seller says, you know what, I want to go fishing on Monday. I don't need a gazillion dollars on Monday because even if you gave it to me, I couldn't spend it fast enough. So I'll take it over time. As long as I have some assurances that if you quit paying me, I'm going to get the business back. And, that's easy to put into an agreement. The chances of that, I have a lot of people that are going to send me hate mail for saying this because they make money on the gazillions of dollars on Monday. But the chances of pulling that off are pretty high because, the seller is not getting any younger and they want to get to retirement and they're willing to take some passive income over time. And the other reason they're willing to do that is for tax benefits. It's more tax efficient for them to do it that way, spread the payments over multiple tax years. So long-winded answers say, yeah, that's highly possible to find circumstances like that. That answer your question?
Yeah, so the seller financing is different than an earnout, obviously, where there's a big chunk up front, and then based on the ongoing performance, the seller, if they attain certain targets, then they'll receive additional payments.
Yeah, those are two different things. So, like when I sold my company, it was a 3-year earnout, and I had to do certain things for 3 years, and that was totally separate than the terms by which we sold. Now they paid us everything all up front because it's a private equity firm. But if you're a small owner of a smaller business and the buyer is smaller, then seller financing is probably more talked about than private equity firm building a venture-backed software company.
Got it. All right. So hurdles that we often hear about in the news with large transactions is disagreement about valuation and difficulty of integration. Is that easier? Are those two things easier with small companies?
Yeah, I think that's obviously, I think you would agree, two very different topics. Valuation is one of my favorite things to think about. It's so frustrating because it's very subjective. And, the analogy I use is you ever walk into a room and there's got like IT people in it and they
I break
talk
out in
like their
hives.
language changes and they start talking about IT stuff that they know you don't understand and you feel like an idiot. Well, that's similar to when you walk into a room of investment bankers and lawyers and they start talking about valuation. And, valuation is very subjective. Sure, it's based on industry benchmarks and people but it's not like, you're looking at a spreadsheet with hard numbers on it. It is very subjective. So that's easier with smaller companies because one of the ways you can deal with valuation disagreements are to put a transaction together that is based on future performance. So if the seller thinks they're worth X and the buyer thinks you're worth X minus something, then the seller should have no problem with, all right, I'll take the deal, but you're going to pay me over time because if I hit these benchmarks under your leadership, you're going to agree that 3 years from now you could have paid what I want, and therefore you're going to agree to do that over time. So that's how that is mitigated in a good purchase and sale agreement.
And do you find many of these silver boomers that are sitting on businesses, are they realistic about their valuation, or do they think their company is worth much more than it actually is?
No, I think it's a truism, myself included. Every owner thinks their business is worth more than it actually is. It's because of that subjective nature of it. Again, the first time valuation comes up, if you're a business owner, is when you go to sell it, or if you have to raise money from traditional investors before you sell it. The issue of valuation comes up. So it's foreign to most business owners. It's not something that you have to understand to operate your business most times. I always like to say, related to this point, there's 3 markets every company has to dip their toe into. And the first one is the one we're all familiar with. It's the operating market. Who are my customers? Who are my suppliers? And that's where our focus is and should be as owners. But there's 2 other markets that every company is exposed to eventually. One is the capital market. I need cash to continue to operate for good reasons or bad. And where do I find it? That's the capital market. That's the one I'm in. The ecosystem for the capital market's usually much different than the operating market. And the other market is the M&A market. So eventually I want to sell my company. That's a whole different bunch of players: investment bankers, lawyers, brokers, exit planners, tax experts, stuff like that. So just think about it that way, that there's three markets, and we got to have a plan for all three markets to have success in the long
Got
run.
it. And again, back to this avatar that we're working with, $50 to $250 million company making an acquisition, say a $10 million acquisition. Is integration a huge concern, or do you find that with good planning that can be pretty easily mitigated?
Well, the short answer is with good planning, it can be easily mitigated like anything else that's subject to good planning. But I would tell you that, there's no shortage of horror stories about the integration being botched,
Right.
and that making what sounded like a good idea a terrible idea months after it happens, and I attribute that to just poor leadership and poor planning.
Got it. I mentioned the hours that you work and the days that you work and the time you put into your day job, and also this passion you have for veteran stuff. Outside of your day job and your work with veterans, is there anything you do to blow steam off besides cruise around in your RV?
Well, I have a motorcycle too. And I once heard that you never see a motorcycle in front of a therapist's office. So the motorcycle keeps me on the right track. But I love what I do. You know that, Ed. So I don't view it as hard work.
Any long rides or just around the neighborhood? Have you ever done the Blue Ridge Parkway?
No, I haven't. I haven't really taken the bike too far other than where I can ride to. But, where I live, I take it down to Southport and, the beach areas,
Right.
but not the mountains.
It would be worth shooting over, doing Skyline Drive and Blue Ridge Parkway. I did that one year. I think I did it in October, and as I was headed south, I got to Boone, and it was supposed to snow the next day, so I never made it quite to Asheville. I had to boogie east before I got snowed on a motorcycle, which is not what
Yeah,
I
you don't
wanted
want
to
to
be
do
doing.
that.
It reminds me one night we came back late. By the time we cleaned weapons and turned everything in, I was driving home. It was about 3 a.m, and I was on my bike, and I only had the face shield, which was tinted, so it was dark and hard to see. But I was riding with it open, and then there was CS gas from a training range somewhere that was blowing across the road. So I put my faceplate down. It wasn't a good situation. I had my snot coming out my nose and tears out
Uh,
of my eyes. And
I bet you kept going though.
yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, quickly to veterans. I mean, obviously, you're a huge advocate of the value the vets bring to business, and I mentioned it's a thread of some of the conversations I've had in this podcast. Just give us your highlights of why you think companies ought to think about hiring veterans.
You know, um, there's a lot to that question, but in effect, it's not what people might think. The answer is, and I've learned this by working with veterans through Vet the CEO for the last 12 years, and me being one of them. So here's what I've learned, right? We are really, really good decision makers, right? So every branch has a manual on decision making, right? The Army has a manual on decision making. And the reason that's important is not only do they teach us that formally, like try to find a college course on decision making that doesn't
Right.
exist, right? But in the military, no matter what branch you're in, it's like I equate it to fitness, like trying to get fit. Like you become mentally fit because you get taught this decision making model that's been perfected over a long time in operations, and everybody learns it from privates to generals, and you run reps through it. So when
Right.
you're on training exercises, you're applying the decision making model. When you get deployed, you're applying a decision making model. It becomes second nature, and you can probably relate to this. So when we leave the military, we're like supercomputer decision makers, right? We're really, really, really good decision makers. So when you implant that brain into a company, you've got a supercomputer there. Not arrogantly, ask most veterans, they won't even like, oh, I guess I am, and because I've been recently talking about this, they don't think it's a big deal, but it is a big deal. And when you implant that into an organization, it can do wonders for you. And the taxpayer has invested in that supercomputer. We ought to get more return on that taxpayer investment when people leave the military and utilize that decision-making ability in organizations. And that's the biggest thing I would tell a business is, trust me on that one. Bring someone in and just watch.
Right.
And they're not going to start barking orders at everybody like everybody thinks. You just watch them make decisions. And it's a wonderful thing.
That's an interesting thought. I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that. There's a lot of the common attributes that certainly everyone agrees on, but that's great input. You mentioned fitness. Are you still getting up every morning and running PT? What's your daily workflow look like?
You know, it's funny. I took up rucking,
Me
and you know
too.
what that is. Yeah. So I just went out. I'm like, long story, but I went out the other day and I put like 10 pounds in a backpack and I'm like, I want to walk 6 miles. I used to hump 50-pound packs for 12 miles. I went on a 6 mile walk with 10 pounds on my back and I thought I was going to have to go to the hospital. But yeah, I try to chip away at that, and my goal today is to look less crappy than the other guys my age. So when you like reset your goal like that, it's a lot easier to get through the day. So
Yeah, in my rucking, I keep thinking maybe I can get back to the EIB standard, 12 miles with carrying a weapon. I mean, I guess a dummy around the neighborhood where I am, but in 3 hours, and I don't think I can do it. I'm doing 10 without the weapon with 35 pounds. It's somewhere around about 240, and I don't think I'm going to be able to get the other two in there
wow,
under
you're
three.
way ahead of me right now, but it's interesting you started and I just did too. So we'll have to keep
But
track
then
of each
I
other
think
there.
back, I used to do it in, I don't know, 210, 212, something like that. And I just, how have I fallen so far? It's frustrating
I know
sometimes.
it's depressing.
All right.
Yeah.
You're a continuous learner. I know you've recommended some books to me. Effortless Experience was a great one that I particularly appreciated. But what podcasts or blogs or YouTube channels or books are you turning to these days for new ideas or inspiration that you'd recommend to others?
I'm a big book reader, so I recommend like the same books to everybody. One of my favorites is Start with No by Jim Camp. It's a negotiation book. I just recently read Never Split the Difference. You've probably heard of that one, written by an FBI agent. Um, I was pleasantly surprised to see Start with No was actually endorsed and referenced in that book. So
Hmm.
they're kind of the two go hand in hand. And as a quick aside, what's funny? I realized as a sales leader that I did for years, you walk into a bookstore or when you used to do that, or a library, and they got the sales books over there and negotiation books are on the other side of the room, right? The two are separate in the bookstore, but if you're going to sell, you need to know how to negotiate first, right?
Right.
So that's just where I see the overlap. Cash Flow Quadrant by Guy Kiyosaki is one of my favorite books, changed my life, and the guy that wrote Rich Dad Poor Dad. Um, so those are the books that I tell people who ask me, who care, what should I read? That's what I tell them to read.
Any podcasts or blogs or YouTube channels?
Not really. Honestly, I'm so busy. I don't listen to a lot of podcasts, shamefully. Only when I'm driving the RV long distances, I'll listen to TED Talks or stuff like that.
Well,
But
now that you're rucking, that's a perfect opportunity
you know what? You're right.
stack them up and listen to them. What's when you listen? What speed do you listen at?
Normal speed.
Yeah, so there you go. Go to 1.5 speed. Put your ruck on. You're gonna have, if you're doing 6 miles, you're probably gonna be out there for an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes. You can work your way through a couple of
You
them.
know what? I'm going to take you up on that. That's a very good idea. Yeah.
All right, let's. We're talking about a lot of exciting stuff. Let's get serious for a minute. Your biggest concern about business as you look at over the next 5 years?
I think competition is so fierce. So you got like these forces that are kind of coming together that, I don't want to be Mr. Doom and Gloom here, and I don't have the answer, but this is what I'm seeing. So we have a couple things colliding. First of all, we have a culture where very few people today actually say no. That's why I like that book, Start with No, by the way. So if you're selling or you're trying to run a business, like very few times, like people just don't like to tell each other no. And in a business context, on social media, when it comes to politics, that's a whole different story. But like when you're trying to be the good employee and work with other companies and trying to sell them stuff, like you very rarely hear no. And so culturally, I think that's a challenge if you're trying to, read the market and make decisions as a business owner. The second thing that makes that even more challenging is what we talked about earlier. There's so much choice. There's always another day to do another Google search to try to find another option. And if you put those two things together, in a company culture, decisions never get made one way or the other,
That's why
and there's always
40% of deals
tomorrow.
now end in no decision.
Yeah, and I'm concerned about that. I think, as a maverick small business owner, if I'm just starting out, and now there are tactics to kind of deal with that we can talk about, but the challenge is how do you like change that condition? And if you can figure out how to change that condition to get decisions made now, you'll be successful. And I think that's the challenge for small businesses. How do you operate in your market, whatever market you're in? Assume that that's the case. How many people get canceled, right? Or they just never hear from anybody again. Like that's the new no. Like you
Right.
just never hear from anybody again.
Ghosted.
That's their version of no. Yeah. But if you're working a pipeline or trying to run a business, like you really never know. They might call tomorrow, and
Next quarter. It's going to close next quarter.
yeah. So I think that's both the opportunity and the threat. I think we got to think out of the box and use some of the marketing tactics we've been referring to today to say, all right, how can we employ our resources in a way where we're creating a market and people are coming to us because of this cool thing that we've put together and we're pushing out there, both outbound and with our inbound tactics. We're creating our own market and we're drawing people in that want it now. We're willing to make a decision to get it. I think that's the opportunity and the threat these days.
And I guess that means if you're a company that figures out how to help other companies, your prospects move decisively and they achieve results from it, then that becomes, a kind of the killer app.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more.
So I'm sure that people, after listening to this, are going to have a ton of questions. And some may say, okay, I'm ready to go look and start talking about what business to buy. So people that want to follow you, connect with you, whether they're veterans or business owners or investors, whatever the case may be, how do they reach you? How do they connect with you?
Well, a couple ways. I'm a big LinkedIn fan, so LinkedIn is always a good way to get a hold of me. It's last name's Panaccione, John with an H, old school John. Um, that's one way. Folacapital.com, FOLLA capital.com is another way to reach me. Yeah, those are the two primary ways to reach me. If you're interested in the stuff we talked about with acquisitions, go to vettheceo.org, vettoco.org, and you can look at that program on the Vet the CEO website. There's also a separate website called passtheguideon.org. And we have a phone app. You can download the app from the App Store and the Android Store for that particular program. So those are ways you can collide with me out there.
Okay, I'll drop links to all those in the show notes as well.
Great.
All right, wrap us up. Set of high-level thoughts on how privately held industrial companies can grow in today's markets.
Well, like I said, I actually miss the days of running Logic Bay. I love the challenge. You have so what I learned, and I'm no expert here. I just made it to the finish line. But one of the things that got me to the finish line was number one, I ran a lot of experiments, and I knew most of them would fail. And I can't stand. I'll say it, academic pundits that tell you focus, focus, focus. What's the one or two things you do well? If I stuck to the one or two things I thought we were going to launch a company, I would have never invented the things that got me to a sale, which is the reasons why the private equity firm wanted to buy me. So what I've learned through that is, constantly test new concepts, knowing and accepting that most of them are going to fail. But through those failures, you're learning. That's how the military, trains us, by the way, as you know, right? Through failure. So we have to have a culture in our companies where we're not being reckless, but we're making thoughtful investments in new ideas and new approaches to see what works and what we can learn from those things that don't work. So that's the first thing. Number two is you got to create your own market these days for the reasons we said. What can we do to create a new bell or new whistle or configure things in a different way? For example, one of the things I'm a big fan of that I had some success with is pricing. I love pricing strategies. Like you can really differentiate yourself through pricing strategies alone. So how can we play with these levers in such a way that nobody else is configuring them so that we can create our own market in a very crowded space? So I think those are the two key things. There's like run a lot of tests and see what works and what you learn from each failure. And then secondly, try to feed that into something where you're creating your own market. You're not trying to chase ghosts in a current market.
Got it. Fabulous conversation, John. Thank you for your time. Thanks for sharing many years of hard-won and accumulated insights and wisdom. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks for having me, Ed. As always, you and I have been doing a lot of stuff together over the years, and I've seen you grow in some great new areas. I've learned from you, and it's another example of that. And appreciate you having me on.
Cool. Absolutely. So for everyone listening, please remember, don't keep John's insight secret. Your friends want to know about it. Your business colleagues want to know about it. Your golf buddies want to know about it. So share this episode. Give us a like on whatever platform you're watching on. Leave a review. It really helps and helps other people discover the information. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.